Welcome. We're on Chapter 8. We did the first 5 problems. We're up to problem number 6. And there's no diagram here, but I've drawn a diagram for you because I think it's going to illustrate what we need to know here. So let's start right in. It says, when a good is taxed, the burden of the tax blank. When a good is taxed, the burden of a tax. So we want to know under what conditions will the burden of the tax be greatest, for example. Okay, let's go to the first one. The burden of the tax falls more heavily on the side of the market that is more elastic. It falls more heavily on the side of the market that's more elastic. Well, that's wrong. But let's keep going. B, falls more heavily on the side of the market that is more inelastic. All right, that's going to be right, and I'll show you why in a minute. C, falls more heavily on the side of the market that is closer to unit elasticity. No, is distributed independently of the relative elasticities. No. So why, look at A and B again, and I've drawn the diagrams here. In this diagram, we have inelastic supply and demand curves, right? Demand curve is relatively inelastic, supply curve is relatively inelastic. What inelastic means is if you change the price, the quantity demand is going to fall off relatively little. In this market, we have the exact same amount of tax change. In other words, this distance is the tax change. I've drawn the exact same tax change, but now we have two elastic or relatively elastic supply and demand curves. Right? And now you can see basically that the burden of the tax is going to fall more heavily on the group that is inelastic. In other words, in this case, I've made them both the same, and actually should change the diagram a bit. What if I had taken this demand curve, and now instead of having two elastic curves, I'm going to make the demand curve relatively inelastic in this situation, okay? All right, let's call this D naught. Now this changes the situation. I still have the same size of the tax, right? Here's the tax. It's still the distance between, there's the tax. But look what's happened now. If this was the equilibrium price before the tax, which we can agree on, all right, right here, before the tax, call it P0. Look what's happened. After the tax has been imposed, the price paid by consumers is all the way up here. I'll put a PT tax. And the price received by suppliers is relatively unchanged. We'll call it PS here. All right? In other words, this distance, which is the tax, is being borne almost completely by the consumers. Why? Because their demand is inelastic. They're insensitive. If you think of this as cigarettes again, they must have them. They're not going to change their habits quickly. Therefore, when the tax raises the price, they continue to pay that high price and cut back on their quantity demanded very, very little. The supply curve is relatively elastic, meaning it's sensitive to price. And so in this particular case, if you raise the price, the suppliers won't pay very much. They will simply cut back on supply. In this case, the consumers will be stuck bearing the burden of the tax because their demand is relatively more inelastic than the supply curve. Okay? So the diagrams are trying to show you that when there's an inelastic market on both sides, they're still both going to split the burden. I'll show you that, right? Here, in essence, suppliers pay this amount of the tax and consumers pay this much. This is because they're both inelastic demand and inelastic supply. But when it differs, when the demand curve is more inelastic than the supply curve, consumers will pay more of the burden, and the vice versa. If the supply curve were more elastic than the demand, inelastic than the demand curve, then the producers would pay more. So who's ever more insensitive to price bears the burden of the tax. And that's really the one, number 6. So the answer for that is B, falls more heavily in the side of the market that is more inelastic. There it is right there. Okay? So if we go to the next question, I'm going to pause here for a minute and put the new diagram up on the board. But it's kind of similar. And if you get this basic idea of burden and elasticity, the next question should go pretty smoothly. All right, let me come back.